Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude and our topic for today is Labor 2005, What's at Stake? And in the studio we have two guests, Liana Petranek, PhD in political science, and you're also a flight attendant with Hawaiian Air. And you were the president of the local Hawaiian Airline Local Association for Flight Attendants, right?
From 1987 to 91. Yeah.
That's good. And also Steve Dinion, he's with the Musicians Union, and he also works with Labor Against War. That's the coalition. It's a national coalition, and we're going to be talking about all those kinds of issues because there's so much at stake for labor in terms of war and peace and other issues regarding minimum wage, living wage, and so on. So would you, Steve, care to tell us something about what you have been doing at the Musicians Union and organizing drives or anything of the sort?
Sure. We've at a couple of areas we're trying to work on. One of them is reaching young people, young musicians. There's been such a loss in the union movement across the board, of course, of the generations, and we see that in Hawaii as well. And amongst musicians, so many of the young musicians that we see or hear about have no idea what their rights and protections could be. They don't know there is a musicians union. They don't know that the idea of musicians could have a union is actually kind of foreign to them. So we've, a couple of years ago, some of our members started a drive, a campaign to kind of help educate young musicians going into the schools, and then also having events where students could come and learn from the professionals very basic things. You know, how do you negotiate when someone wants to hire you for a gig? How do you protect yourself? What are your rights? How do you make a CD? Things, all kinds of different things like that. So that's been we've started a once yearly seminar, free seminar, open to anybody, students, parents, teachers, young professional, starting out musicians.
And even like the groups that play in the neighborhoods and all that?
Groups that play, yeah, we had, we just did, last month we just did one, and we actually had a group, a trio from Kalaheo. They played all high schoolers there, but they came and they got to jam a little bit with some of our professionals as well. But a lot of these young kids do play out there now, actually on their own, and so it was a kind of a good chance for them to hear. We had our rank and file professional musicians who were there to kind of give presentations and talk about what it's really like and what they need to do to look after themselves. So you see, this is kind of a part of a long kind of effort, a long-term effort to really bring in the next generation. Yeah.
And you also belong to a national union. Is that so? What could you say something about
the musicians?
That? Yeah.
Yes, we are the local for the American Federation of Musicians, which is throughout the U.S. and Canada. And so we represent all kinds of musicians, recording musicians, symphonic musicians, freelance players. Anyone who plays an instrument and gets paid for it, or sings and gets paid for it, can be a member. About 100,000 members. Like most unions in the U.S., of course, we've seen a loss of membership as well. We're losing about 1,000 members a year nationally, and that's been a big issue that, unfortunately, we haven't figured out how to tackle, and we need to desperately stop that from happening. We need to be gaining members.
Yeah. So we can talk later on about what do you attribute this issue to and so on. Okay. But going to Liana, in terms of your airlines, not only like Hawaiian, but the local airlines and maybe the main issues regarding those airlines that they are dealing with now in terms of negotiations. Are there any negotiations going? Are there any problems in terms of bankruptcies and so on?
Well, we just voted to ratify an agreement that the negotiators negotiated. It was a really close call. At first, the flight attendants turned it down because what is happening is, and this is throughout the industry, what is happening is the companies are trying to undermine our medical benefits. And you'll see this happening not only in the airline industry, but everywhere. What's happening now is we're going to be paying about $60 more for, like, for instance, a family plan. We did not get any real wage increases because actually the 1% that they negotiated for us amounts to maybe $40. And then if you're paying $60 for medical, you're actually $2 under. And then there were some work crew changes as well. Now for extended range flights, they want to put on only 8 flight attendants if we're not 80% booked instead of 9 flight attendants, which is going to affect our working conditions because we're going to all have to work harder, even if we have less passengers. And
but that's the FAA that has to get into this to say 9 is okay, 8 is okay, not 9 or something.
Well, actually, it's within the FAA requirements because they require 1 flight attendant for every 50 passengers, and we hold like a maximum of 264 passengers. So actually, there could be 6 flight attendants and it would be okay. But the thing is, you can't carry out the service that you want to carry out if you only have 6 flight attendants, especially if you're going to do a first class and a main cabin service. So it's been a struggle, and we've been trying to maintain the working conditions and benefits and pay that we have. But like I said, we've had to give up something in this last contract negotiation, even though Hawaiian Airlines has been profitable most of the 5 years past. You know, it's only in the last year or so that they claimed, you know, a loss, and therefore they went into bankruptcy. But actually, bankruptcy was more a strategic move because they wanted to renegotiate the leases with Boeing so that they would be in a better financial position to compete with the mainland carriers.
Yeah, what we're going to do now is go and watch a segment, a video segment of Eric Gill, and Eric Gill will be joining us momentarily the show, and then we can ask him to comment on this segment. It's from November 2003 when Eric was a guest here, so he'll be joining us right after the segment is shown. We go. So changing the face of at least Local 5.
Well, I think the key to changing the face of Local 5 or any other union is to recognize where the source of the power of the union comes from, and to be able to direct and wield resources of the union to build on that power. And, you know, in its final sense, and when you get right down to it, the power of the union comes from the membership united, the members being united together to act as one and to utilize their numbers both, you know, on the street, in the ballot box, and so on. The labor movement has had a period in Hawaii of a fairly extended peacetime, if you will, where, you know, where the political interests in Hawaii didn't really come four square and challenge us head on. And I think many of our unions got a little bit complacent and haven't really organized themselves well enough to withstand this. You know, here we have Bush, you know, making all-out attacks on labor, which has been pointed out, and that's certainly true. And yet many of our members are still entranced maybe in whatever propaganda or, you know, the macho posturing of Bush, which appeals to maybe the baser instincts in American people. And, you know, we need to be able to educate our members. We need to be able to organize them, and we need to be able to produce their bodies at the voting booth to vote. And that requires organization and communication, and it requires us, and it has required us in Local 5 to redirect resources to do that. You know, whereas in the past maybe the staff was used in a different fashion. That builds our power, both in contract negotiations, which certainly every member understands, and we need to be able to extend that out into the political field as well, and make people realize, as they once did, that working people have a common interest, and that we're all in this together, and that we should vote for candidates and so on that represent our interests. So as far as what's going on in Local 5, we continue to have challenges. We've had, last year we had a big crisis trying to set a standard for the hotel industry, and we were successful in setting a pretty good standard. And we've been basically trying to wrap the rest of the hotels into it. Just last week, Friday, we were able to settle with the Kahala Mandarin on the basis of the standard. And I think as a hopeful sign, as Ray said, we all have to join hands. Our union and Aoude have for many years been at odds for a variety of reasons, but there's some hopeful signs there, and Ray and I were able to cooperate and negotiate a good contract for 2 hotels, one represented by either union, which are owned by the same owner. So I think we have some models to build on. But ultimately, I would love to be able to talk about a union campaign to redraft or repeal Taft-Hartley.
Yeah, that'd be
I
great.
think at this point we're trying to hold on to what we got, as Ray said, and I think the solution to both is the same. Get reorganized, focus on the membership, get real about making members involved, and build that power base, and that will help defend us as well as set the stage for us to move forward as well.
Good. Yeah, we have a.
That's it.
Okay, so Eric, we were just were talking before you joined us that the musicians union, they've been losing members, and it's like a trend across labor. So you have been gaining members. What have you been doing of late?
Well, in order to successfully organize new membership, it takes a fair amount of resource allocation. You got to actually go out and fight for it. It's not easy when you're a union that management doesn't like. They make it as hard as they can, and so we haven't been able to direct enough effort toward organizing yet. We've been in a state of constant crisis to maintain our standards and to fight our contract negotiations. However, there are some real good hopeful signs on that. It is possible to organize, and there's a big debate going on in the FFL-CIO about that, about whether or not it's possible to organize and whether the FFL-CIO should organize itself in such a fashion that would allow that to take place, allocate sufficient resources, and specifically stop unions from cherry-picking each other. I think the biggest problem in labor is that unions have not redesigned themselves to new conditions, and specifically new conditions in our industry and many others of globalization of ownership. There's what we are, we no longer fight local owners. We no longer fight them on contracts or on organizing, and therefore it's necessary to build power in such a way that it can be effectively applied on a national, international, global, hemispheric basis to match the power of these global corporations that we now work for. The notion that we can just go out and organize in the old-fashioned, and it's not really the old-fashioned, I would say the fashion of the last 30, 40 years was, you go out, you sign cards, you have an NLRB election, and the company will fight back, and you pour resources in, and the company fights back, and oftentimes management wins. And if you win the election to get representation, then you have to go do it all again to get a contract. And what we've found in our union across the country is that it takes just as much effort to get a single contract out of a big corporation as it might get, if we were able to apply national pressure to get an agreement from that corporation to organize a number of shops. And, we learned this lesson very hard. Our local 2 in San Francisco spent 6.5 years organizing the first Marriott hotel that was organized from the ground up. It was a 6.5-year fight, and as it turned out, local unions all across the country and the international union had to put huge resources to get that one place. So now we are positioning ourselves to do organizing in a big way. In other words, we need to get enough leverage, enough power, enough push on a national basis to extract an agreement from big corporations that they will not fight the union coming in in a number of places and so on. So this is what is the model for successful organizing in the last few years has been on that basis. And the service employees have been more successful than just about anybody in that on that basis. So they deploy a large number of staff and build committee, and they get strategic information. They involve themselves in corporate decision making, stockholder action, investor action, what we call a comprehensive campaign that comes at the management from many different angles, not just from deploying members. But of course, it's all based on being able to deploy the members. So you have to have that to make the other pieces work. But when an agreement is reached, then you have what's called a card check neutrality agreement, where the company will, in essence, agree in advance that they won't fight the union if you can show a majority status among the bargaining unit. And so the service employees have been quite successful. On the West Coast is one of I'm most familiar with, but you know, they've 50,000 members in a couple of years through this thing, through a card check process that's applied corporation by corporation. And you know, you also have to play smart. You have to have good research. You have to be able to look at the different competitors and play them off, and so on and so forth. So it's a very sophisticated process, but it works. It can't work, however, just with one local union, relying on its own resource, when you just can't get enough pressure on a corporation in one locality. So our next negotiation's coming up next year, and we're off to, we are actively seeking and very actively organizing ourselves to try to provide national mutual support between the various different local unions around the country that have contracts with these big hotel corporations.
Okay, great, yeah. So we'll talk more about a few things that you have been doing recently in terms of organizing, like hiring people to organize and stuff like that. I heard it through the grapevine, but we'll talk about it in a bit. But Liana, Eric talks about globalization, and that the unions are beginning perhaps to position themselves in such a way, organize themselves in such a way so that they can better organize people. So the thing that is at stake actually for labor as a whole, regardless of not just trade unions but labor as a whole, is the losses that the workers have been having because of globalization, because they are on the receiving end for that. Could you speak more to the politics of it, perhaps? Yeah.
Well, I think, on the whole, the unions have always been on the defensive, and I don't think they've been keeping pace with the trend with, the transnational global apparatuses that have come into being through globalization. What we need to be thinking about is like global union membership, and we need to attack things like the World Trade Organization and agreements like NAFTA and GATT. I was just looking at our newsletter that we get from the Communication Workers Association. It's really funny because in the last 10 years, over 50 unions have merged, and the reason why they've done that is because they don't have the resources to aggressively counteract what has been happening within the union movement. I mean, it's gone down like from 1950, 35% to like 12% in the public and the private sector to actually 9% in the private sector. So they're looking at ways and trying to redirect resources, which Eric brought out. And the CWA has come up with a 10-point proposal, and one of them is to actually assert more social action, to have political unity when it comes to candidates, so that you don't have somebody supporting Kerry and somebody supporting Bush. You know, we should look at political agendas, and see who would actually represent us, and then go for that candidate in particular. They have to start looking at, you know, instituting strike benefits that people can exist on, like instead of, you know, not going on strike and not having any kind of strike benefit, at least $200 a week so you can survive during the course of the strike. Collective bargaining and organizing rights. They're trying to pass in the legislation Employees Free Choice Act, which would give more democracy to the union in different industries and stuff like that. All of that stuff already exists, but then we need to pass an Employee Free Choice Act that would give, you know, the unions more leverage in trying to organize people. All kinds of things are being negotiated. In this 10-point thing that they're proposing to the AFL-CIO, but I think unions, you know, are having a struggle with globalization, because we do not have the development that we need in order to counteract the forces of globalization.
Yeah, and Steve, like you were saying that you've been losing members, so what do you attribute that to?
There's certainly a lot of reasons. Nationally, it includes actually globalization has affected the music industry as well. It's the recording industry in particular, CDs as well as movies. You know, soundtracks. Used to everything was always done in the U.S. for U.S. movies. Now they can do it much cheaper, going to England or going to especially Eastern Europe. So we do see that used to be one of the more lucrative and stronger parts of our union, is the recording industry, and that's changed a lot. We deal with a lot of smaller, you know, a lot of our members work on a freelance basis, so they're not working for a regular employer. Here in Hawaii, what happened is, you know, we used to have all of Waikiki, all the main hotels in Waikiki were all under collective bargaining with us, and so all the musicians who worked there were union members. And as the hotels were bought up by multinationals and changes happened, including a subcontracting clause, which was our last collective bargaining with the Council of Hawaiian Hotels. 1983 or 84, it had a subcontracting clause which allowed the hotels to actually subcontract out all the musical work to a third party, and the third party did not have to uphold the same wage scales and working conditions. And that pretty much wiped us out.
Yeah, so
there's nothing there's almost nothing left in Waikiki that's union music, very little left there.
Yeah, so like in terms of
music.
Music at all, which is a technological changes that certainly affected.
Yeah, high technology.
Music.
In the process of production of like CDs, etc., and then going to places where labor is cheaper, like you know, Eastern Europe and other places, that affects this. So that speaks to the notion of labor, like going global as well, because I mean the corporations are organizing globally. So why not begin the process, you know, from like Waikiki to Hawaii, neighbor island, you know, Oahu, neighbor islands, you know, nationally and so on, you know, step by step, but at least we have to begin to do those kinds of issues, But I'm going to take this opportunity to remind our viewers that this is a live show, and you can contact us, questions, comments on Oahu, 956-5670, and Neighbor Islands, 1-800-342-7949. So we'd love to hear from you, and especially if you have some experiences regarding the issues we are talking about. Eric, I just heard that you have hired new workers, actually one or two of them from our students to help you in organizing or something.
Did we do that?
That's what I heard. I don't know. Is that a rumor?
we are really having a challenging time training appropriately trained and staff, and it's what we found is that the best recruits that we have are committee leaders who have already shown their abilities in the course of a contract fight or a different kind of struggle that we have. What we found is that, you know, we need really more than anything else, more than skills, more than abilities and experience, what we need is people with the heart, because ultimately workers respond to that more than anything else. They want to know that the person leading them will really fight for them, will you know, has their interest paramount, is not building a career or, you know, so on and so forth, but actually is on a mission to build workers' power and to fight for social justice, economic justice, and so on. And so we have hired and we continue to hire people. We did pick up one of our students here, and she distinguished herself actually in the hotel, as opposed to the school. We don't. Frankly, I have no idea what kind of student she is, but
she's good.
She's good. But she proved very valuable in our political work in the past election, and you know, really showed us something. So we're going to pick her up, and she's going to be helping us with our big fight with the Turtle Bay Resort. Don't stay there. And you know, and so we are going to be able, as we build, and what we're doing is we're building a staff of union activists who are, you know, who come out of the struggles that we have, and as we train enough of them, we will be able to deploy more of them in different directions, and so we fully intend to do that. In regards to the organizing, I wanted to segue a little bit on what Liana said. I think, you know, what you have going on here is a rapid, precipitous decline of unions that don't get it, in my opinion. They just don't get it. And of course, there's many reasons for that. You know, people who have been union leaders in the last several decades have been union leaders under certain conditions. When the conditions change, they may not be able to have the skills and the, you know, the skill set and the, you know, the personality or whatever it takes to meet that new condition. And frankly, the new condition requires sacrifice on the part of union leaders. There needs to be fewer unions. They need to be bigger and more powerful. They need to be organized along industrial lines. They need, you know, there need to be mergers of unions. And our union merged with the needle trades last summer for that reason, to build our power, to be able to make some strategic alliances. You know, for example, with this merger, we are organizing the big commercial laundries and organizing the hotels that get their linens and uniforms from big commercial laundries. This is a strategic alliance. We think that there should be far fewer unions in the AFL-CIO, and they should merge. And they should do that in order to concentrate their resources, you know, as broadly as possible, nationally and globally, to put those kind of heavy resources into building big organizing campaigns on a mass basis. You know, this is how the labor movement was built. In the 30s, for example, steel and auto were organized, right? Steel was organized by virtue of the fact that the mine workers went and said, we're going to plunk this pile of money and all these activists, and we're going to have a big organizing campaign and go after all the steel mills at once. And steel mills, of course, had withstood organization for many years, and very violently and bloodily, you know, a Homestead strike, you know, strikers being shot up by Pinkertons and so on. Many failed attempts to organize. When it finally succeeded, it was succeeded because a big, powerful union with resources was able to do it on a bulk basis. And so the model is there, but the unions are not ready to utilize that model. You know, they're not. They're just not. There are too many unions in too many industries, and it's just crazy. You know, what the unions end up doing is chasing to the bottom. In other words, if Union A wants more members, and they'll then go out and say, okay, here's a bunch of people that want union. It may not be in our jurisdiction. We may not have anybody else in that industry, but we're going to go get them and make them a union because they're better off union than non-union, which is kind of a platitude. But in actual fact, unless you have the rest of the industry, how do you build a standard? As soon as you raise standards there, the competition will eat up that shop. You have to have an industry-wide approach in order to make effective change in terms of really raising standards. So unions are all over the lot. We've got unions in industries they've never been in, and they don't plan to grow in. And we've got unions that you know, that represent this shop here and that shop there, and there's no effective way to coordinate power against a big united employer. So the debate in the FFL is around that. I'm not really familiar with the communication workers program, but the essence of it is that you know, our union believes in an event that the FFL has to start effectively policing jurisdictions. They have to be able to say to one union, look, unless you're going to really do it, don't do it. You know what I mean? And they have to be able to put those resources back. And, you know, for example, the recent FFL board meeting, the motion failed, unfortunately. But the motion was that the FFL should rebate 50% of an international union's dues if the international union can show and prove that they're going to use that money to organize in their core jurisdiction.
Good. Yeah.
You know, so, you know, for example, we've done that. I think every union's done that to a certain extent, with the possible exception of the musicians. but you know, I mean, you know, so I've got a Kamaboko factory that we represent. Those workers, they're fine people. I don't plan to organize the rest of the Kamaboko factories. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If there are any, you know, but I mean, what I mean to say is that having that kind of unit is fine for those workers, and they should have a union, and it's fine, and we should find a way to get them unions. On the other hand, unless you get all the Kamaboko factories, what are you going to do for them?
Yeah, right.
So it becomes very cynical, and some unions have become very, very cynical. They'll go out and get a shop because the workers want union, which is, of course, most workers do want union. You know, if the company didn't threaten your job, everybody would be in the union. But they collect the dues, but they can't, and they don't have a strategic approach on how to raise that standard.
I wanted to ask Steve in regards to the question of politics and labor. I mean, a lot of you know, unions now hitch their wagon to the Democratic Party, for instance, right? But there is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Labor Party, for instance. The Labor Party is trying to say, well, maybe we shouldn't go Labor, or I mean Democrat or Republican, but maybe Labor should go and do something else, organize itself, etc. Go for campaigns like healthcare campaign and this campaign and the other campaign, educate workers in you know, what they're in terms of their own interests, etc. So, are you familiar with those kinds of issues?
A little bit. I can't say I know a lot, but I do know that, to me, it makes a lot of sense to not be bound to one of the two parties that are currently in power. I think, although the Democratic Party has often through its history been supportive, and you know, we've seen in Hawaii especially there's been a close relationship with labor, but to have to at least put out there the idea that we should have some kind of party apparatus organization that represents workers across the board, workers as a class, that could. Unfortunately, that would take a lot of changes to the system. The system is only set up to have two parties, and as you know, Ralph Nader showed, it doesn't want to allow anything else, and it succeeds at that. But I think there are examples. I think in New York State, I think it's the Working Families Party, which, because of the law there, it is its own party, but I believe it's able to actually cross. Candidates can be on two different lines at once. So there are candidates who are endorsed by the Working Families Party who are also on the Democratic ticket, and that has given, I think, workers there and labor there a little bit more leverage at times. And New York is, I I think it's first or second in terms of union density in the country.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it seems to me that there should be some room for that discussion, and there could be a lot of value for us.
Because it seems to me that education is very important in terms of the workers, to educate them in terms of what they're interested about globalization, about all those kinds of issues, and move them into certain campaigns like, healthcare, etc. Because one of the things is to have like a relationship between the trade union movement and communities, at large as well, because there are, those communities are, white collar, blue collar, and they are workers, etc. So there are those kinds of other issues. So I think that's important
there have
to
been
do
some real
so.
success stories. I know. I think in maybe in Hartford, Connecticut. I think the AFL had a role in this, but there was a joint. The local union movement there really made an alliance with people living in the area, and there were a lot of issues, living issues, things like housing and living wage and things like that, and they made work together, and it worked both for the unions and their members and the folks in the community. It was apparently very successful.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Liana, did you want to say something about that?
I think workers on the whole should be educated more about the class nature of their situation, because I was reading some information and they were saying that workers today make less than middle income workers in 2000. And this is because job loss and medical benefits that they have to pay more for have offset the so-called tax cuts that was supposedly have gotten from the Bush administration. And they also say that 1/5 of all workers in the United States live below the poverty line for a family of 4. And this is like working full-time with the kind of wages that we get. And they say that like 1/4 of the American workers are having financial difficulties, even though they're being paid
Only
union wages.
1/4?
Yeah. Well, they're saying
I know.
So actually, we should find a common element amongst all workers, whether they're union workers or not, and try to organize and educate people about things like health care and the need for a socialized medical system that would take care of everybody. Because what is happening now is, like in the private sector and in the public sector, they're trying to erode our medical benefits. And I think even more progressive companies are looking at, the federal government playing more of a role in supporting, medical benefits for people. So I think people have to be, looking at how the government can actually help us, because the unions need to make people aware of the situation on a global scale, how globalization is affecting us, and how competition is affecting their possibilities of competing with other trade blocs, like, for instance, the European Union and Japan and China. And therefore, because they have to compete, they're lowering the prices of all of the commodities that are being produced, and therefore that's affecting our working conditions and our pay. So the thing is, we need to look at things on a global scale and look at the government and see what kind of role it can play in improving the lot of the workers in the United States.
Well, what I'm going to do before we go and talk more about like Turtle Bay and what's happening with that, I'm going to shift the discussion a little bit regarding, the role of labor in terms of national and international issues. In mind, we have the war in Iraq and, this whole kind of globalization and the push for U.S. domination. And so what I want to do is play a segment from when Steve was on this show last time, and then take it from there and ask you to comment, and then we talk about that.
What is a kind of an ad hoc committee formed in early 2003, a number of labor folks in the community who were trying to look for ways that, as workers and as representatives of workers, how we should react to what was going on in terms of the build-up to war with Iraq, in terms of what was happening with the Bush administration's war on terror, so-called. kind of got together and started to talk about ways to understand what effect do these wars have on workers. And some folks from hotel workers, Local 5, and a number of different unions got together, and we had 4 main areas that we were looking at. One, the most important or most timely, was to oppose the efforts the Bush administration was building towards going to war against Iraq. We were also looking at what we saw as a war on immigrant workers that seemed to be growing. Also the war on civil rights through the Patriot Act. And finally, the war on government workers that the Bush administration was spearheading, particularly people in the Defense Department, Department of Homeland Security. So those are our 4 main areas we were looking at, and mostly trying to find ways to educate and organize workers in Hawaii around those 4 issues.
Yeah, that's great. But Liana, I thought that George W. Bush always talks about war. Yeah, okay, so before I ask you to comment on it, we have a caller, David from Oahu. You're on the air, David.
Hello.
Yes, you're on the air.
Yeah, I'm a Local 5 member.
Uh-huh.
And I have a question for Eric Gill.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm trying to get a hold of you for quite some time, but I work for the Ilikai Hotel, and we have a contract from the 2002 year, 2006, but yet to be signed. Why would that be?
Why is the contract not signed?
Excuse me?
You're asking me why the contract hasn't been signed?
Right.
Well, I suggest we go ask Mr. Canberra that. We have presented him that document for signature for some months now, and the general manager doesn't seem to be able to bring himself to sign it yet. We nonetheless have a contract, and we have a signed memorandum of agreement that incorporates the entire contract. So we do have a contract. What happened is, you know, when we make a new contract, you have to take the pieces of that contract and put the new parts in with the old parts and line it all up, and then you argue about commas and phrases and what's in this letter and what's in that section, and an employer that wants to have that argument does have it, and frankly, none of these hotels particularly like the fact that we won the last contract negotiation and got a very good contract, so they're making it as difficult as possible. I do anticipate that one will be signed. However, they are in the middle of a bunch of things going on, as you probably know, and we're going to use that leverage to get it signed, among other things.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
Would I be able to meet with you tomorrow?
Excuse me?
Would I be able to meet with you tomorrow?
If you want to come to Chicago, you can.
You're in Chicago, okay. Yeah, because Eric Tam or you I've been told are the only ones who can make a decision for me. I've been trying to get a hold of you for quite some time.
Well, I haven't heard about that, so maybe you should call my
David
secretary.
Robinson.
Yeah,
David
okay.
Robinson at the
You call him, he'll talk to you after Chicago.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, so, well, that's good. You know, one of the guys wanted to, and good thing that it was cleared up. Just like to shift the discussion a little bit before we go into Turtle Bay and stuff like that, because I think this is very important to talk about. So could you comment on what you were saying, and what have you been doing since? Yeah.
Sure. I guess the first thing I thought as I was listening to myself talk there is it's all pretty much the same. You know, all the concerns that we had here, that a lot of labor had nationally about what the Bush administration was doing or was planning on doing. All our worst fears were proven, I think, pretty true. And it's all continues to go on. The war on, you know, the attacks on immigrant workers, immigrants' rights in general. The Bush administration is in there now trying to get the Patriot Act renewed. The attack on federal workers has, you know, continued and gotten worse, and the war in Iraq continues as well. And more, you know, Iraqis are being killed. The country's has been taken over and sold off, and it's in terms of stopping that, U.S. Labor Against the War has, which is the kind of the national umbrella group that has came out of the a lot of these efforts nationally, has done a number of things. It's helped coordinate efforts among different local and national and international unions to take stands against the war. So we've had local unions like Local 5, who has come on the record as opposing the war and calling for the withdrawal of troops, as well as international unions like CWA, AFSCME, and SEIU, two of the biggest unions, if not the two biggest unions right now, I'm not sure, have both had very strong resolutions calling for immediate withdrawal of the troops. So. And then also the U.S. Labor Against the War has been working on building bridges and solidarity between Iraqi workers and Iraqi unions. There is a union movement in Iraq. It continued. It was underground during the Saddam regime, and it has tried to come out, and it's been actually pretty strong. The workers in Iraq have taken very strong positions, and some of their leaders have paid dearly for it. They're amongst the folks that have been targeted by some of the different forces arrayed there. Unfortunately, they've also been targeted by, in some sense, by the Bush administration when the coalition, when the Provisional Authority was running things, and this continues. The CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, and continued to enforce a Saddam Hussein law which forbade public sector workers from having unions.
Which is everybody in Iraq.
Which is everybody in Iraq at the time, exactly. And, you know, which is not exactly, didn't really bode well. It kind of, I think, showed, obviously, Bush's hand and what really this was all about.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Did you want to say something on that, Liana?
Well, I wanted to comment on what Eric was talking about earlier about the difficulty in negotiating contracts. I was watching on TV, and there was this young guy who was trying to organize the Walmart workers, and he had a very difficult time, and they went up for a vote, and he lost, even though he put so much effort into it. And that is because the Walmart Corporation had a lot of resources to block any kind of efforts that he might have put into it. And on that particular occasion, I mean, what should have happened is like the major unions should have poured more resources into that
to help him out.
To help him out, yeah. And what we had in the past is this concept of business unionism, and this is something that I had a problem with when, well, in the early '80s when we were trying to organize MidPac, and we had gotten enough people.
Mid-Pacific Airlines.
Yeah, Mid-Pacific Airlines.
Which no longer exists.
Yeah, we had enough people that signed cards to join the union. I kept calling the National to send somebody up here to hold an election so we can get this done. And they decided, they did a cost-benefit analysis, that it would be too expensive for them to do that, so they just pulled out. And even though I kept calling them, they said, no, they're not going to put their efforts into organizing MidPac. So, I mean, that was something that they should have really looked at in a different way, you know, because actually, you know, we should have gotten those people organized so that we could maintain our pay and working conditions without another competitor, you know, being paid less and then undermining our airlines. And, you know, it's like a ripple effect, you know. If you don't get people organized, it's going to have, you know, an effect on you as well. And also what's happening is like when you get properly organized, even though they might vote for the union and the company, when they negotiate the contract, the company can just, you know, drag their feet on trying to implement the contract, and this is something that Eric is having with the Ilikai workers. So, I mean, you have so much of a struggle trying to implement whatever you can from the union level with all of these obstacles against you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, David and other people should also call the manager of Ilikai and ask him to do so.
You know. Them too,
maybe we should get a whole bunch of workers to go up to the manager's office, and we've done that on several occasions. We've filed charges and various things. You know, without workers' participation, you know, the push on them isn't as much.
What?
Just wanted to say one more thing about what Stephen was talking about. You know, because our government has not put a concerted effort into creating jobs on the national level, I mean, and there are all kinds of things that they could do. They could put money into, you know, states to develop infrastructure, schools, and all kinds of other stuff. Because they're not doing that, what they're doing is they have this war, and they're getting all of these young people, you know, to join up with the military, and that that's the kind of work that they're providing, which is kind of really a shame because, you know, we should be using our tax monies to improve life for everyone in the United States. You know, we could put it into schools, you know, ecology and environment and all kinds of other stuff. But what we're doing is we're bombing Iraq and sending our people off to war to get killed.
That produces a lot of commodities like tanks and Humvees.
Yeah,
and
but only in certain industries.
Yeah, I know. But, well,
broaden,
that's the kind of jobs they're
Yeah.
creating. Yeah. What I want to do before we talk about Turtle Bay, because it's an interesting thing to do, is we have one roll-in with AQ McElrath, you know, discussing issues that are related to labor, and this comes from February of this year when she was on the show. So we'll do that.
So that, let's face it, a good deal of what she is doing so that she will get reelected next year. Now, as far as the minimum wage is concerned, there are a number of bills in the legislature now, which one bill takes it up to $7 an hour in 3 years. Another one takes it up to $7.50 in the same number of years, and they index it to a cost of living index, whether they're going to use the federal poverty level or the CPI, I'm not aware of. There has been discussion as to whether or not we should also have legislation for a living wage. As you well know, the AFSC, the Friends Committee, 5 years ago came out with a living wage study. The person with whom I spoke about this matter said, well, maybe we can have either one of the two. Well, I haven't seen yet, although I haven't finished reading all of the bills, whether or not the living wage concept will be put into effect. But in either case, you would at least take care of those, many of whom who work only 20 hours a week or less than 20 hours a week, the manipulation of employers to get out of the Prepaid Health Act, for example. But in any event, raising it to $7.50 an hour and then index it to the rising cost of living certainly makes a lot more sense than keeping them at a wage for 5 years, 10 years. Actually, it went up to $6.25 just in January, right?
That's right, 625.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Okay, so you know, AQ is talking about minimum wage and also living wage, and this is an important thing because it was you know, talked about at least in the legislature. I don't know the nature of the bills at this point, living wage, but also you know, the question for say Local 5, you know. You have your own problems negotiating for your own workers, etc. But do you also have some kind of issues that you raise with, say, since this is a legislative session is on, with the legislature in terms of such issues as minimum wage, living wage, and so on?
Yes, well, we haven't been nearly as active as I would like to have been down there. We spent a fair amount of time this past week looking at some of the legislation they have going down there. One thing we're very interested in is the notion of corporate welfare, because ultimately, when you look at politics or whatever, you know, the war, I mean, there is a full-scale attack on working people, and it is successful. And in fact, some people on the corporate side have already declared victory. And you know, one aspect of that here is that our politicians have seen fit to, you know, give our hard-earned tax money to corporations, in essence, that don't need it, in the form of
they
tax
want
rates.
it, but they don't need it.
Well, certainly, and they are not they're not hesitant to go down to the legislature and press the flesh and talk to people and pass some money around on election time. And so, for example, we have you know, I think in last year's session they gave $75 million to Jeff Stone to build in Ko'olina. Which is going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, the timeshare market is hot. I mean, the hotels are hot right now. I mean, you don't need to encourage these corporations to build on our beaches. They got our beaches. And we're now paying them to build on our beaches with our tax money, and there is no quid in et pro quo. I mean, there is no string attached. There is no requirement whatsoever that the developer provide good jobs at the end of the day. You know, and specifically, a good job is a good job with benefits, rights on the job, job security, in short, a union job. So that, you know, we feel strongly if the government's going to be passing out our tax money to corporations, what does the community get out of that? I mean, politicians might get campaign contributions out of it, but what does the public get out of it? What are the taxpayers who are working people? We're the ones who pay the taxes. And, you know, so thousands of new jobs supposedly growing up in Ko'olina, and not a single requirement for the $75 million of our treasure that the developers provide good jobs at the end of the day, or any jobs necessarily. Or any jobs for leeward people. So that's a good example of what the kind of thing we like to take up. We want to take up issues that show clearly the class nature of what the politics is about. You know, in this society, you're for corporations, you're for working people. Which is it? And the issues like this will be the cutting edge to kind of show people where the politicians are. Now, I would say that this year, especially since the Governor Lingle was elected, the Democrats in the legislature seem to be a lot more anxious to pass bills that they previously might not have. With the expectation the governor will veto them, which makes everybody real happy politically. But you got to wonder if the governor wasn't going to veto them, if they would be passing them. But ultimately, you know, a politician wants two things in life. You know, one is to get elected, and the second is to get reelected. And so, you know, it's up to us. I mean, I think we have not done our responsibility well in terms of organizing our votes and making sure that politicians who fight for working people will get reelected.
Yeah, good. So we have a few more minutes left. Before we go to Turtle Bay, I just want to see if either of you or both of you have something to say about this issue of living wage or other things that would benefit all workers and not only your particular union, for instance.
I would just say, you know, for musicians, living wage, actually minimum wage doesn't have much to do with it, although except for the fact that most of our members make so little they have to work day jobs. But I think that the union movement as a whole benefits when we do something that is for the working class. And living wage is something that it's good for unions to support for that reason.
Yeah, I was reading American Friends article, and they were saying that the living wage on Oahu is like $14 an hour, and the minimum wage does not even equate that, you know. So the thing is, we really need to press for a living wage, you know, in the unions. And then the other thing too is, like, we should be adamant about doing that, because all of the tax credits that corporations and the technologies industry and the film industry has gotten from our government with Act 221 and all the tax credits that are available when you fill out your taxes is just incredible. And the thing is, with all of the money that we're just handing out to these corporations, we could be using that money to do things to encourage, you know, more union workers to get more money. You know, they could be, you know, using the money for other things.
Okay. So,
like, for instance, building schools and stuff like that, and hiring union workers and you know, doing the infrastructure of the whole state. Like, for instance, in Hawaii, we have a problem with the sewer system. They need to hire more workers in the city and county and pay them more so that they can, you know, live comfortably in Hawaii. There's all kinds of things that we can use for that money that they're just handing out to these corporations.
Okay, so we have like 1 minute or so. So could you tell us more about what's happening now at Turtle Bay? I know it has been
Turtle Bay. We have a classic example of a corporado. You know, this is a corporate entity that has come to our community. They bought a distressed property. They want to sell it. They have no interest in staying here in Hawaii. And in order to sell it, they need to break the union and break the trust fund benefits of the workers in order to get a better sale price. And they have made that threat. They are actively attempting to do that. Our workers out there are great. They are wonderful. They're strong. They're going to win. Don't go to Turtle Bay.
Yeah.
And you know, it's unconscionable, the kind of thing that they're doing right now. The company is attacking our retirement medical benefits. They are literally trying to throw our retirees out of medical.
Okay, we're flat out of time. Thanks to our viewers, and thank you very much, and see you next month. Aloha.